Have you ever been in a place where no one knew who you really were? Where all you carried was the weight of your memories and the cold of a winter that seemed never-ending? For Arthur, that Christmas night wasn't like the others. And perhaps, for the people in that community hall, it wasn't either. Outside, the wind howled like a lost wolf, shaking bare branches and scattering snow across the cobblestones. The Christmas lights flickered in the houses around, some out of order, others shining as if they were trying to push away the darkness. Arthur walked slowly, his worn coat buttoned up to his neck, hands shoved in his pockets. He looked like any other man, but there was something in his gait that set him apart from the crowd. An invisible weight, an aura of someone who had seen and lived through so much. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was different. The sound of joyful voices filled the space, blending with the melody of "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," softly played on the piano by a young girl with delicate, slender hands. The smell was unmistakable. Roasted turkey with rosemary, fresh cornbread just out of the oven, and the sweet scent of Christmas pudding being served in simple bowls. Despite the laughter, the exchanged glances told different stories. Some were there to celebrate, others to forget. Arthur stopped at the entrance. His tired eyes, marked by wrinkles that don't come without great loss, swept the room. He saw families sitting together, sharing pieces of bread and hope. A group of children ran around a tree decorated with paper stars and makeshift golden ribbons, laughing without knowing that Christmas can be so much more complicated when you're an adult. In a corner, an older man sang softly to himself, his gaze lost in memories only he knew. Arthur moved forward, almost invisible, until he found a chair near the tree. He sat down slowly, like someone who didn't want to disturb. He took off his hat, revealing white hair neatly combed but worn by time. His fingers drummed lightly on his knee as he watched. There was so much to see, so much to feel. People with little, but still sharing everything. A boy ran past him, nearly knocking over a dish of potatoes. Arthur smiled for the first time that night. A small, almost imperceptible smile, but real. He whispered to himself, "This is what they need. But will they understand what I need?" Who was that man? And what was he doing there? Sitting among strangers, with a secret so big it could change everything. Arthur seemed like just another face in the crowd that Christmas night. A discreet man, with controlled gestures and a gaze that always seemed to be searching for something, though he never asked for anything. The community hall was full of people from all walks of life. Entire families, couples, lonely elderly folks, and even a few children running around the main table. There, no one asked about the past. It was a place where people could put aside their burdens for a few hours and simply exist, surrounded by human warmth. But if someone looked closer, they would notice something different about Arthur. It wasn't just the way he moved, as if he were out of place, yet at the same time completely at peace with it, nor the fact that he seemed to be studying every face, every gesture, every smile. There was something in his silence, a silence that seemed laden with memories, perhaps even regrets. In the hall, the music played softly. "O Holy Night," sung by a woman with a sweet voice, filled the air with a sense of reverence and hope. Arthur remained quiet, but attentive. He noticed the woman with gray hair adjusting the silverware with almost obsessive precision, as if that was her way of bringing order to a chaotic world. He observed the young couple sharing a single dessert plate with knowing smiles. He also noticed the solitary man at the back of the room, staring out of a foggy window, lost in thoughts that no one seemed to dare interrupt. As his eyes wandered around the room, he also absorbed the little details. The glow of the Christmas tree lights, flickering in sync with the children's laughter. The aroma of mashed potatoes and turkey, blending with the scent of freshly baked bread coming from a woven basket. This was Christmas. A simple Christmas, without ostentation, but it seemed to carry more love and meaning than any party Arthur had witnessed in recent years. He saw a little girl sitting alone at a table near him. Her plate was full, but her big brown eyes were fixed on another child playing with a new toy. Arthur smiled, though that smile came with a pang of sadness. He had once been a child like that, observant, quiet, trying to understand the world around him. For a few seconds, he got lost in thought. He thought about all the Christmases of his life. The good ones, when his family was together and the laughter was genuine, and the bad ones, when he would lock himself in an empty office, surrounded by work, while silence was his only companion. How much time had he spent trying to fill that emptiness with material things, with expensive gifts and lavish parties? And yet, now, here, sitting in a simple wooden chair, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. But what if they knew who he really was? Would people still treat him with that pure, sincere kindness? Or would everything change? He didn't want that. He didn't want the feast to become a spectacle, nor for people to see him as someone different. He wanted to remain Arthur, the man sitting at the table, watching and listening. Still, there was a decision he knew he would have to make. He carried with him a secret, one that could transform this night for everyone present. It wasn't just about what he could offer, but about what he himself could learn. As he looked at the main table, filled with scratched glass dishes and secondhand silverware, something inside him shifted. How could something so simple be so grand? It wasn't the shine of the decorations or the aroma of the food that made this Christmas special. It was the way people shared what little they had, with genuine smiles and open hearts. Arthur took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision that was to come. He knew this night wouldn't just be about what he saw or felt. It would be about what he needed to give, not money, but something far greater. Who was Arthur? That was the question no one asked. But when the answer came to light, it would not only change that Christmas in the hall, but perhaps the lives of everyone present. The community hall seemed too small for the number of stories it held that Christmas night. The walls, painted in an old beige that had already worn down with time, were decorated with garlands made of crepe paper in shades of green and red. Beside the entrance, an electric fireplace tried to mimic the warmth of a real one, but its flickering light did more than that. It filled the room with a cozy, almost magical charm. In the center, a long table dominated the hall. It was covered with a simple white cotton tablecloth, stained in some spots, but carefully stretched as if it were a family heirloom. On it, platters and bowls were mixed in an improvised banquet, full of smells that spoke directly to the heart. There was roasted turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, sautéed vegetables, and homemade bread. Beside it, a smaller table held desserts, apple and cherry pies, puddings decorated with walnuts, and a chocolate cake with half-melted frosting that made the children eye it sideways, waiting for the right moment to attack. But what really filled the space wasn't the food. It was the sound. Timid laughter, conversations full of interrupted stories, the clinking of silverware against plates, and in the background, a woman in a light blue dress gently playing the piano. She was playing "I'll Be Home for Christmas," a melody that seemed to warm the hearts of everyone there. Arthur leaned slightly forward, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. He observed everything attentively, not just what was in front of him, but what was in between the lines. Every smile carried weight. Every laugh seemed to have an undercurrent of sadness that no one dared to reveal. He realized that many of the people there weren't celebrating Christmas, but surviving it. Near the entrance, a mother held her baby while trying to balance a plate with one hand. Her eyes were tired, dark circles betraying sleepless nights, but she smiled as another woman helped her cut a piece of meat to put on her plate. On the other side, two young people exchanged quiet words, occasionally laughing. But there was something in the way they looked at the nearly empty plates that Arthur recognized. He knew what it was like to live with little, even though his current life said otherwise. In a more distant corner, a group of children gathered around the small Christmas tree. It was decorated with hand-cut paper stars and chains made from strips of newspaper. The lights flickered unevenly, but to the little ones, it seemed like the most beautiful tree in the world. One of the children held a red plastic sled, already worn but provoking envious looks from the others. Arthur noticed this and watched for a moment, remembering his own childhood. How he once received a handmade sled from his grandfather, and how that gift, though simple, was the most special of his life. As he watched, the hall seemed to grow before him, as if the stories and feelings of the people around were bigger than the space they occupied. There, every detail told a story. The makeshift decorations, the interrupted conversations, the sound of the children, and even the smell of food mingled with the melted wax from the candles. It was a humble setting, but so rich that Arthur felt something inside him stir, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. And in the middle of it all, he kept asking himself, why am I here? What am I really looking for? He looked around once more, and his attention was caught by an elderly woman entering the hall, leaning on a cane. She wore a light brown coat that seemed too large for her small, bent body. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Arthur noticed how everyone greeted her with affectionate smiles, calling her by name. She was clearly a well-known and beloved figure in that place. When she reached the main table, she began to distribute small homemade loaves of bread, made with such care that her hands trembled as she placed each one on the plate. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He was used to grand gestures, donations that came with contracts and exorbitant numbers. But that bread, so simple, seemed to carry a much greater meaning than any check he had ever signed. And then, he realized something. It wasn't the bread, the music, or the lights that made this place special. It was what people put into it, their stories, their pain, and their hope. That was what made this community hall so different from any other place he had ever been. Meanwhile, outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the street in a white blanket, as if trying to erase everything heavy and make space for a fresh start. Arthur adjusted his hat on his lap, running his fingers over the worn fabric, as if that gesture could silence the thoughts piling up in his mind. Though he sat there like everyone else, it was impossible to ignore that there was something different about him. It wasn't his simple appearance or the polite, yet reserved way he responded to any greeting. It was the depth in his gaze, a gaze that seemed to carry decades of untold stories. He knew that, in that room, no one knew him, and that was exactly what he wanted. Not that he was running from who he was, but that night, in that place, he wasn't the successful businessman everyone usually heard about. He wasn't the man on magazine covers or in acclaimed interviews. He was just Arthur, or at least, he was trying to be. He looked around, observing once again what made that place so special. Every face, every gesture, every laugh seemed to tell a story that no one was willing to hide. There were no masks there. He felt a slight pang of envy, not of the poverty or the difficulties that many were undoubtedly facing, but of the freedom. They were free to be exactly who they were. Arthur, on the other hand, had spent years building an image that now felt like a prison. The businessman who never made mistakes, who always had the right answer, who donated large sums of money, but always from a distance. He was the man who showed up at gala dinners and shook important hands, but didn't know the names of those working on the floors of his factories. And at that moment, as he watched a little girl laughing beside a woman who must have been her grandmother, he realized how empty all of it was. How long has it been since I truly participated in something like this? He asked himself. Not a social event, not a business meeting disguised as a celebration, but a genuine moment where people were simply together. He clasped his hands in his lap, thinking about his own childhood. The Christmas nights when his mother, even with so little, made a point to prepare something special. He remembered the smell of bread baking in the oven, the makeshift candles in the center of the table, and the laughter filling the small room of the house where he grew up. It was simple, but it was magical. And now, sitting in that community hall, he felt an unexpected connection to the people around him. He didn't know them, but it was as if they shared something, a nostalgia for simpler times, a longing to feel part of something bigger. A woman passed by him carrying a platter of mashed potatoes. "Is everything okay, sir?" she asked with a gentle smile. Arthur nodded and responded, almost embarrassed. "Yes, thank you." She gave a wink and continued walking, leaving Arthur with a strange feeling. That small gesture, so simple, so unpretentious, made him realize how far he had drifted from moments like that. He was used to people who only came close when they wanted something, who smiled with ulterior motives. But here, there was no hidden agenda, no need to impress. He adjusted himself in the chair and looked at the small Christmas tree, decorated with care that, for many, might seem childish, but for him, seemed like an act of love. It was as if each ornament, each piece of ribbon, carried the soul of someone who believed Christmas could still be special, even in the hardest days. As his eyes scanned the hall once more, he asked himself, deep down, do I really belong in this place? He knew the answer was more complicated than a simple yes or no. But that night, he wanted to find something. Not just a moment of peace, but a meaning that had seemed to escape him for so long. Arthur took a deep breath. He knew that the next few hours would be decisive, not just for those people, but for himself. Arthur observed the hall with eyes that saw more than the people around him could imagine. He saw beyond the crepe paper garlands, the platters of simple food, and the misaligned chairs. He saw what few noticed, the spirit of solidarity that filled the room, a silent force that kept everyone united, even in the face of hardship. And yet, something inside him remained restless. He couldn't shake the question that had echoed in his mind since the moment he crossed the door. Why am I really here? It wasn't just the desire to observe, to connect, or to be part of it. It was something deeper, something he still couldn't name. He wondered if he had lost the true meaning of Christmas. After all, for years, the holiday had been nothing more than a series of mandatory events. Lavish parties, toasts with crystal glasses, expensive gifts he had bought for employees he hardly knew. All of that, he now knew, was just empty gestures or performance. But here, in the community hall, things were different. He saw it in the woman who, despite wearing a patched coat, offered her seat at the table to an older man. He saw it in the children who divided themselves to play with a single toy. And he felt it in the music that kept playing in the background, filling the space with a soft melody that seemed to carry the hopes of everyone present. Arthur couldn't help it. He began to wonder, how many Christmases have I spent just existing, without really living? How many times was I so quick to give, but never really present? These thoughts troubled him. He shifted in his chair, as if he wanted to escape something. But the truth was, there was no escaping it. Not that night. His gaze fell on a family sitting near the tree. A man and a woman, hands intertwined, were talking to their little daughter. The girl, with curly hair tied with ribbons, seemed enchanted by the tree ornaments, pointing to each detail as if it were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Arthur noticed how the couple smiled, exchanging glances that said it all. They had little, but the little they had was enough. He wondered if he could learn something from them. Is this what Christmas is about? Not what you have, but how you share what you have. And then came the hardest question of all, one he had tried to avoid for years, but which, in that moment, seemed impossible to ignore. Am I still capable of feeling what they feel? Can I still find joy in simplicity? As the thought reverberated within him, something caught his attention. An elderly woman, with gray hair and a face marked by time, began handing out pieces of homemade bread. Her hands trembled slightly, but there was a sparkle in her eyes, a sparkle that told him she took pride in what she was offering. Arthur watched her for a moment, intrigued. He didn't know who she was, but he felt that she knew something he still needed to learn. Something about what it truly meant to give, not just with your hands, but with your heart. He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of his own questions. He knew there would be no easy answers, but he also knew he couldn't leave without facing them. After all, this Christmas would be different. It had to be. And so, while the hall continued to be full of life, Arthur allowed himself one final reflection. What if what I've been searching for all this time was never in the grand gestures, but in the small moments, like this one I'm living right now? The clock on the wall showed almost 8 o'clock at night, and despite the cold outside, the hall was warm, not only from the electric heater but from the human warmth that seemed to fill every corner. The snow was falling in slow flakes, sticking to the fogged-up windows, creating a natural frame for that special night. This community hall was more than just an improvised space. For many, it was a meeting point, a refuge in difficult times. For years, this small community had gathered there to celebrate Christmas. No matter how hard the year had been, there was always a feast. Not for the sophisticated dishes or the shine of the decorations, but because the feast symbolized something greater: resilience, unity, and the promise that, even in the darkest moments, the Christmas spirit could bring a little light. Everything there was the result of shared efforts. The food was donated by neighbors, small merchants, and even strangers who had heard about the feast through a discreet ad in the local newspaper. The piano, now playing soft chords of The First Noel, had been lent by an elderly couple. The Christmas tree in the corner of the room, though simple, had been decorated with the enthusiasm of hands that believed in the beauty of improvisation. Each person in that hall had a story. There was a woman who had lost her job earlier in the year, but with the help of friends, she made sure her children still had presents that night. There was the young couple who had moved to the city in search of a new life, leaving behind almost everything they owned. There were also those who came alone, with no one to share Christmas with, but who found there a temporary home, where their names were remembered and their smiles valued. Arthur was aware of this. He heard fragments of conversations as the sound of plates being filled and children's laughter echoed in the background. Sitting in his chair near the tree, he noticed how every detail in that environment spoke of hope. Not grand or idealized hope, but simple hope, the kind that helps people keep going. On the opposite side of the room, a small framed picture hanging on the wall caught his attention. The frame was light wood, slightly cracked, and inside it was a hand-stitched phrase. At Christmas, the greatest gifts are those that can't be wrapped. Arthur read it several times, as if the words had been written for him. He thought about his own life. To many, he was an example of success. A man who had it all: power, money, recognition. But there, in that community hall, he felt the weight of something he couldn't buy. The desire to belong, to connect with something genuine. As he looked around, his eyes landed on the figure of the elderly woman who was still handing out homemade bread. People greeted her warmly, calling her Miss Evelyn. Arthur watched her for a few minutes. There was something special about that woman, an energy that seemed to illuminate everyone she touched. "Miss Evelyn," someone said, "you really outdid yourself this year. These breads are divine." She laughed softly, a laugh that carried years of wisdom and a serenity that only comes to those who have learned to find beauty even in the greatest difficulties. "Ah, dear," she replied, "what is a bread without someone to share it with? Christmas is only Christmas when we share." Arthur felt a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. Those words stayed with him, lingering in his mind. He looked again at the frame on the wall and thought once more, the greatest gifts are those that can't be wrapped. It was true. He knew that. But why, then, did he feel like he had never received a gift like that? Or maybe he just had never recognized one. The context of that night was clear. People who had little but shared everything. A community that understood that the true spirit of Christmas wasn't in grandeur, but in unity and generosity. And Arthur, at that moment, realized that perhaps he had come there not just to observe, but to learn. Arthur shifted in his chair, his gaze still lost in the words embroidered on the picture frame on the wall. Something inside him was stirring, as if the bricks of an invisible fortress were slowly crumbling. But he still didn't know why. It was then that a scene on the other side of the hall caught his attention. Miss Evelyn, the elderly woman who had distributed the bread so carefully, approached a family sitting near the Christmas tree. It was a small family, a man, a woman, and a little girl no older than 7. The girl had curly hair tied with red ribbons and a shy smile that seemed to light up her face, even amidst the modesty of her clothes. Miss Evelyn bent down to the girl's level and handed her a small package, wrapped in simple paper and a faded satin ribbon. "This is for you, dear," Miss Evelyn said with a smile. The girl's eyes widened, holding the gift with both hands as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "You didn't have to," the mother began, visibly emotional. But Miss Evelyn shook her head firmly, gently interrupting her. "Christmas isn't about what we need, my dear. It's about what we can offer." Arthur held his breath. He watched as the girl carefully unwrapped the package, as if she wanted to prolong the moment as much as possible. Inside, there was a handmade rag doll. The stitching was imperfect, the embroidered eyes were slightly different sizes, and the dress was made from a patterned fabric that seemed to have been repurposed from something larger. The girl's reaction, however, was instant and genuine. She hugged the doll to her chest and looked at Miss Evelyn with teary eyes. "She's perfect. Thank you." The simplicity of that gesture hit Arthur like a punch to the chest. He watched as the girl showed the doll to her parents, who smiled, and then to the other nearby children, who gathered curiously. It was just a doll made from scraps. But to that little girl, It seemed to be the most valuable gift in the world. It was in that moment that Arthur felt a sharp pain in his heart. It wasn't physical, but emotional, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He thought of his own childhood, the few times he had received something handmade. He remembered the feeling of holding something that carried the effort, the care, and the love of someone. How long had it been since he'd felt something like that? He looked away for a moment, as if trying to process it all. But when he looked back at Miss Evelyn, he saw something that left him even more unsettled. She was looking directly at him. Her eyes, full of wisdom, seemed to pierce through him, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. Arthur swallowed hard, looking away again, but it was too late. Something was changing inside him, something he wasn't sure he could control, and that was when he asked himself a question that changed the course of the night. When did I stop believing in the magic of Christmas? The answer, he knew, wouldn't be easy to find. But he also knew that he could no longer ignore the truth that was beginning to emerge in his heart. Arthur felt the impact of that exchange like a wave, pulling him into a place he hadn't visited in a long time. Sitting in his chair, hands crossed over his knees, he tried to keep his composure, but the scene wouldn't leave his mind. The little girl holding the rag doll with so much love, Miss Evelyn's serene expression as she handed over that simple yet profoundly meaningful gift. He looked down at the floor, trying to hide within himself, but the emotions were right on the surface. Why was it affecting him so much? It was just a doll, just a gesture, and yet it seemed to have opened a door inside him, a door he had locked decades ago. Arthur took a deep breath, but he couldn't contain the thoughts that began to emerge. He remembered his father, a stern but fair man, who never had much to offer at Christmas, but always did the impossible to make sure there was something special on Christmas Eve. He remembered the year his father spent hours fixing a broken toy he found in the trash, painting it blue with the little paint they had at home. When Arthur saw it on Christmas morning, he felt like the luckiest boy in the world. And now, so many years later, he wondered, when did presents stop having meaning? He looked around the hall again, trying to anchor himself in the present. He watched the children running around the tree, adults laughing in small groups, the tables full of improvised dishes. Every detail seemed to intensify the feeling he couldn't describe. Miss Evelyn, however, wouldn't let him escape. She was still near the tree, talking to other people, but her eyes kept returning to him from time to time, as if she knew he was struggling with something, as if she understood. Arthur wanted to get up, wanted to leave and escape that overwhelming feeling, but he couldn't. Something was keeping him in that chair, something telling him he needed to stay and face it. When did I become so distant? He asked himself. When did I stop valuing what really matters? He knew the answer, though he didn't want to admit it. It all started when he chose the path of success, leaving behind the nights when simplicity was enough. He had surrounded himself with luxury, with people who admired him for his achievements, but not for who he was. And now, there, in that hall, he felt the emptiness he had created over the years. As these questions echoed in his mind, he saw the little girl run up to Miss Evelyn, holding the doll in one arm and hugging the woman with the other. It was a spontaneous hug, no words, but filled with so much gratitude that Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to regain control. When he opened them, he realized Miss Evelyn was approaching him. Her steps were slow but steady, and she brought with her the same calm, welcoming look. Arthur's heart began to race. He wasn't ready for this. "Good evening, sir," said Miss Evelyn, stopping beside him. Her voice was soft but full of presence. "You seem to be enjoying observing." Arthur hesitated, swallowing hard before answering. It's a beautiful place. The people are special." She smiled. "Yes, they are. But you're not here just to observe, are you?" Arthur remained silent. The question seemed simple, but carried an enormous weight. No, he wasn't just there to observe, but he didn't quite know why he was there. Miss Evelyn tilted her head slightly, as if she could hear the thoughts he wasn't saying out loud. "Christmas is funny like that," she said. "It has a way of reminding us of what we've forgotten, and sometimes of showing us what we need to see." She lightly touched his arm, a nearly imperceptible gesture, but one that seemed full of meaning. "Enjoy the night, dear. You've come here for a reason." And with that, she walked away, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts. He sat there, motionless, feeling the weight of every word she said. Miss Evelyn was right. He knew that. But what he needed to figure out that night was what to do with that truth. Arthur remained seated, watching the hall as if searching for something, or perhaps someone who could give him answers to the questions that kept echoing in his mind. The conversation with Miss Evelyn had left him unsettled. Her presence, so simple and full of meaning, seemed to have uncovered something inside him. But at the same time that he felt a strange urge to act, something paralyzed him. He didn't know how to connect. He no longer knew how to blend in. The hall, which had once felt so welcoming, now began to intimidate him. He saw groups talking and laughing, families gathered around tables, children playing around the tree. And he, a man used to being the center of attention in corporate meetings, felt like a stranger. "I shouldn't even be here," he thought, looking at his hands. He started to hear small fragments of conversations around him, words that somehow seemed to amplify the discomfort he felt. "It's so nice to see everyone together, sharing. I wouldn't trade this for anything," said a woman, passing by him carrying a platter. "Even in tough times, what matters is that we're here," commented a man at a nearby table, holding the hand of a child. The words were simple, but each one seemed like a little needle poking at Arthur's heart. He tried to ignore them, tried to return to the comfortable silence that had always protected him, but he couldn't. That was when a young man, looking just over 20, approached the table next to him. He wore an old hoodie and a red Christmas hat, and his smile was wide and confident. He seemed to know everyone there. "Hey, sir," said the young man, looking at Arthur. "Would you like some coffee? We just made a fresh pot." Arthur hesitated. "Oh, no, thanks. I'm fine." The young man didn't insist. "All right, but if you change your mind, just call me. Oh, and my name's Kevin, in case you need anything." Arthur nodded in thanks, but he felt a tightness in his chest. Kevin walked away, but left something in the air. A discomfort Arthur couldn't ignore. The gesture of kindness was so simple, so unpretentious, and yet Arthur felt unable to return it. "Why is this so hard for me?" he thought. Suddenly, something else caught his attention. A voice from the back of the hall, loud and filled with sarcasm, interrupted the harmony of the atmosphere. "Oh, look who came here to feel better about the poverty of others." Arthur turned his head and saw a skinny young man, with messy hair and a worn-out coat, staring directly at him. The room went quiet for a moment, as some people tried to hide their discomfort. "Enjoying the show, sir? People like you think tossing a few coins makes you saints," the young man continued, with a bitter smile. Arthur was left speechless. He felt the eyes of some people turn toward him, while others looked down, clearly uncomfortable. He knew the young man was reacting to his presence there, to his posture as an observer. And, although the attack was unexpected, Arthur couldn't help but feel that there was some truth in those words. Miss Evelyn, who had been on the other side of the hall, raised her hand to intervene, but Arthur lightly shook his head, signaling for her to let it be. "You're right," Arthur finally said, his voice low but firm. "Maybe I don't know what I'm doing here, but I'm trying to understand." The young man seemed surprised by the answer but kept his defiant gaze. Before he could respond, Miss Evelyn crossed the hall, coming toward Arthur. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice full of calm. Arthur simply nodded, but inside, something had changed. He realized that the young man wasn't just rude. He represented a bigger obstacle, the very disconnection Arthur felt from that place and those people. He looked at Miss Evelyn and, for the first time that night, asked something he had been holding back. "How do you do it, Evelyn? How do you manage to be so present?" She smiled, as if she had been waiting for that question. "Oh, dear, being present is the hardest thing in the world, but it's also the most important. And sometimes, it starts with something simple. Listening." Arthur fell silent, her words echoing in his mind. He knew he needed to do more than just observe. After the incident with the young man, the hall slowly regained its usual energy. People began talking again, still casting occasional glances at Arthur, as if trying to figure out who he really was. However, he no longer seemed as comfortable as before. There was something about that confrontation that had deeply affected him. Miss Evelyn was still nearby, but said nothing more. She seemed to know that Arthur needed time to process what had happened. He, in turn, looked down at the floor, his thoughts swirling in his mind like leaves carried by a strong wind. It was then, to his surprise, that the little girl with the red ribbons, the same one who had received the rag doll, approached him. Holding the doll in one hand and a plate with a piece of pie in the other, she stopped in front of Arthur, looking at him with childlike curiosity. "Would you like some pie?" she asked in a sweet, hesitant voice. Arthur looked up, caught off guard by the simplicity of the gesture. Don't worry about me, dear. You can eat it yourself." But the girl didn't move. She hugged the doll to her chest and looked at him with a shy smile. "Mommy said that at Christmas, we have to share." Arthur was speechless. He looked at the girl, at the plate in her small hand, and felt something that had long seemed lost. The purity of an unselfish gesture. Without thinking much, he took the plate and said, "Thank you. What's your name?" "Emma," she replied, smiling. "That's a beautiful name, Emma," Arthur said. He picked up the fork on the plate and cut a small piece of the pie, tasting it. It was sweet, but simple, with a hint of cinnamon that seemed to warm him from the inside. He looked at Emma again. "Did you know this is the best pie I've ever tasted?" Emma giggled, hiding her face behind the doll. "It's not my pie. It's Miss Evelyn's. She makes the best things." Arthur laughed too, a rare sound that seemed to have gotten lost somewhere between his responsibilities and his loneliness. "Well, I guess you're right." Emma sat beside him, holding the doll. For a few moments, there were no words between them, just the sound of the hall around them, laughter, plates being served, the soft music still playing in the background. "Does she have a name?" Arthur asked, pointing to the doll. Emma shook her head. "Not yet, but I'll think of one. Can I suggest one?" Arthur asked. She nodded, curious. "How about Hope?" he said. Emma frowned for a moment, as if deeply pondering. Then, she smiled. "Hope is perfect." Arthur felt an unexpected lightness in that moment. Hope. Maybe that was exactly what he needed too. As he and Emma continued talking, her mother approached. "Emma, don't bother the gentleman," she said, looking at Arthur with a polite but cautious smile. "Not at all," Arthur quickly replied, raising a hand. "She's great company." The woman seemed to relax a little. "Thank you for saying that. She's been talking about the doll all day. It was such a special gift." "It really was," Arthur said, looking at Emma. He realized that moment, so small, yet so genuine, had more meaning than many of the grand events he had organized over the years. When Emma and her mother walked away, Arthur was alone again. But this time, he didn't feel the same emptiness as before. He looked around the hall with new eyes, realizing that he wasn't just surrounded by people. He was surrounded by stories, by connections that, somehow, were beginning to envelop him too. And for the first time that night, Arthur didn't feel like a stranger. Arthur watched Emma and her mother as they walked away, still thinking about the unexpected weight of that moment. He looked down at the empty plate in his hands and gave a small smile. It was just a piece of pie, but it seemed to have filled something much greater. However, before he could dive deeper into his thoughts, the young man who had confronted him earlier, the one with messy hair, approached him again. "So, sir," the young man began, crossing his arms and looking directly at Arthur. "Are you just going to keep watching, or are you going to actually do something?" The tension in the hall began to rise again. A few people around them stopped talking, leaning slightly to listen. Miss Evelyn, who was on the other side of the room, looked at Arthur with a concerned expression. Arthur placed the plate on the table and stood up slowly. There was no anger in his eyes, but a firmness that seemed to come from a deep place inside him. He looked at the young man, and for the first time that night, he didn't feel the weight of insecurity. "You're right," Arthur said calmly. His voice cut through the silence like a soft blade. "I've been watching, but maybe it's time to do something about it." The young man raised an eyebrow, surprised by the response. He seemed to have expected resistance, but there was no disdain in Arthur's words, only honesty. Arthur looked around, taking in the hall, the people, the moment. He knew he could no longer hide behind the idea that he was just there to observe. He needed to be part of it. "What's your name?" he asked the young man. "Ryan," the young man replied, still skeptical. "Well, Ryan," Arthur continued, "maybe you're right. Maybe I need to do something. But tell me, what would you do if you were in my shoes?" Ryan hesitated. He clearly hadn't expected the conversation to go this way. I don't know, but I wouldn't just sit there like you were." Arthur nodded. "Fair enough." He looked around the hall again, his gaze landing on Miss Evelyn, who was watching him with a slight, encouraging smile. "Then, help me," Arthur said, turning to Ryan. "Show me how I can be useful." The hall fell silent for a moment, and then Ryan shrugged, trying to hide his surprise. "Well, you can start by helping in the kitchen. They need people to serve." Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to light up his face in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. "The kitchen, then. Let's go." As he followed Ryan to the back of the hall, where a small group of volunteers were hurriedly washing dishes and organizing platters, a few people began to murmur among themselves. No one knew exactly who Arthur was, but everyone could see that something had changed in him. The kitchen was small and improvised, with a single sink full of plates, pots, and bowls. Steam rose from a large pot, while a woman stirred its contents with a wooden spoon. Arthur paused at the entrance, looking at the organized chaos before him. "Hey, we need someone to dry the dishes," a voice called from the back. Arthur walked over and grabbed a towel, beginning to dry a plate carefully. His movements were slow at first, as if he were trying to adjust to the task, but soon he found a rhythm. As he worked, he started to hear the conversations around him. Stories of hardships, shared laughter, small jokes about the kitchen hustle. "You've never done this before, have you?" Ryan asked, leaning against a nearby counter, watching Arthur with a curious look. "There's no shame in learning something new," Arthur replied, not taking his eyes off the plate he was drying. Ryan laughed, but not in a hostile way. There was something different in his posture now, a slight openness, as if he were beginning to reconsider his view of Arthur. And then it happened. One of the volunteers let slip a comment that completely changed the course of the night. "Do you know who he is?" said the man, looking directly at Arthur. "I think I've seen him on the news. He's that businessman, Arthur Caldwell, the guy who donated a fortune to that hospital last year." The hall went silent again. Ryan stared at him, his eyes wide, and Miss Evelyn, who had come over to help in the kitchen, just smiled slightly, as if she had known the truth all along. Arthur sighed, placing the plate he was drying on the counter. He knew this moment would come. There was no way to avoid it. "Yes," he said finally, his voice firm but without arrogance. "My name is Arthur Caldwell, but tonight, I don't want to be that. I just want to be another person trying to make a difference." The silence in the kitchen seemed to stretch longer than it should have. Everyone was looking at Arthur, some with curiosity, others with surprise, and some, like Ryan, with a mix of distrust and skepticism. The revelation of his identity had shifted the atmosphere in the hall. It was as if an invisible barrier had been raised between him and the people around him. Arthur placed the towel on the counter and took a deep breath, looking around. He recognized those gazes. They were the same ones he saw at gala dinners and corporate events. Admiration, expectation, judgment. And that was exactly what he feared. Ryan was the first to break the silence. "So, you're a millionaire?" he said, crossing his arms and tilting his head, his tone slightly challenging. "What's someone like you doing here? Trying to prove something?" Arthur turned to face Ryan, meeting the young man's gaze. He realized he couldn't avoid that question. "No," Arthur replied calmly. "I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here because I needed to remember something I lost along the way. Something that, seeing all of you, I'm starting to understand again." Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly dissatisfied with the answer. "And what would that be? The guilt of being rich?" "It's not guilt," Arthur said, his tone firm but not aggressive. "It's connection. It's valuing moments like this that are priceless. I spent so many years building a life that seemed perfect but was empty. And when I saw this hall, when I saw people like Miss Evelyn, Emma, and even you, I realized there was something here that I needed to find." The words hung in the air for a moment, but Ryan's skepticism remained evident. "It's easy to say nice things when you have millions in the bank," Ryan retorted, his voice laden with bitterness. "You can go back to your mansion tomorrow and forget this ever happened." "We don't have that option." Arthur felt the impact of the young man's words like a knife in his chest. He knew there was truth in them, but he also knew that running away was no longer an option. He needed to face it. "You're right, Ryan," he said, taking a step forward. "I can go back to my house tomorrow, but that doesn't mean I want to. I'm here because I want to be better, because I want to learn from you." Miss Evelyn, who had remained silent until then, placed a gentle hand on Ryan's shoulder. "Sometimes, dear, people come to places like this not because they want to teach, but because they need to be taught." Ryan looked at her, his shoulders relaxing a bit, but his expression was still cautious. He shook his head slightly but didn't say anything more. Arthur returned to the counter, picking up the towel again. He knew he couldn't change Ryan's opinion in one night, but that wouldn't stop him from trying. As he went back to work, the murmurs in the kitchen began to fade, and people resumed their tasks. In the main hall, the conversations and laughter resumed, but now with a slight air of curiosity. Arthur felt occasional glances in his direction, but he didn't avoid them anymore. A few minutes later, Emma appeared at the kitchen door. She was holding the rag doll and looking at Arthur with that shy smile. "Do you want to see my doll, Mr. Arthur?" she asked, breaking the tension with the purity of her question. Arthur smiled. "I'd love to, Emma." As he crouched down to listen to Emma talk excitedly about hope, he realized that, even amid the conflict, there were small moments of reconnection, moments that he needed to cherish. He still felt the weight of Ryan's words and knew that it wouldn't be easy to earn everyone's trust. But for the first time in years, he was willing to try. Arthur watched Emma as she spoke about her doll. Her face lit up with a simple joy that seemed to sharply contrast with the whirlwind inside him. Every word she said, every gesture, seemed laden with meaning he couldn't ignore. "I decided Hope likes tea," said Emma, holding the doll in one hand and making a gesture as if pouring a cup with the other. "She likes sweet tea, but just a little bit, because otherwise, she makes a mess." Arthur smiled, but his mind was elsewhere. The confrontation with Ryan had left deep marks. The young man's words echoed in his head. "You can go back to your mansion tomorrow and forget this ever happened." For a moment, he wondered if Ryan was right. He could leave, return to the comfort of his luxurious life, and perhaps pretend that night had never happened. But at the same time, something inside him knew that this was no longer an option. He thought about his life up until that moment. All the success, the achievements, the grand figures, it all seemed so distant now. He remembered how many times he justified himself by saying he donated money to important causes, believing that was enough. But now he realized it wasn't. Donating was easy. Being present, as Miss Evelyn had said, was the hard part. As Emma continued talking, Arthur looked around the hall again. He saw Ryan helping to carry platters of food to the tables, his face still serious, but calmer. He saw Miss Evelyn talking to a group of older women, all laughing at something that seemed to be an inside joke. He saw families sharing meals, parents cutting pieces of meat for their children, young people exchanging laughs while serving themselves dessert. And for the first time in many years, Arthur felt an emptiness that wasn't related to what he had or didn't have. It was an emotional emptiness, the weight of all the connections he had lost over time. He remembered a specific Christmas, years ago, when he was at the peak of his career. It was a luxurious night, full of important guests, refined dishes, and extravagant decorations. But that night, he spent most of the time alone in a corner, with a glass of wine in his hand, watching others like a stranger at his own party. "Maybe I lost myself that Christmas," he thought, closing his eyes for a moment, "and I never found my way back." Emma tugged at the sleeve of his coat, bringing him back to the present. "Mr. Arthur, do you think Hope will like to sing Christmas songs?" Arthur opened his eyes and looked at her, surprised by the simplicity of the question. "I think Hope will love it," he replied with a genuine smile. Emma laughed, a sound that seemed to dispel the cloud of dark thoughts hanging over him. "Mr. Arthur," she said, looking at him with childlike seriousness, "why do you look sad?" The question hit Arthur like a blow, but he didn't avoid it. He took a deep breath, trying to find an answer. "I think I'm trying to remember how to be happy, Emma." She tilted her head, thoughtful, as if trying to understand. "I think you can be happy if you want to," she said finally. "Mommy says we just need love and to share things." "That's Christmas." Arthur felt the weight of her words, so simple, but so true. He knew Emma was right, but he also knew it would take time for him to relearn that. He looked again at the hall, at the people laughing, sharing, and creating memories together. He couldn't change the past, but maybe he could do something that night, something that would begin to fill that emptiness. Arthur felt the weight of Emma's words still hanging in the air as she ran back to her mother, laughing and holding her doll carefully. He watched her for a moment, then looked back at the hall. Everything seemed clearer now. The conversations, the laughter, the small gestures. Every part of that night seemed to shout what he had ignored for so long. The true value of Christmas wasn't in the grand gestures, but in the meaning behind them. He looked at his hands and felt the damp towel he had used to dry the dishes. It was such a simple, everyday task, but somehow, it carried more meaning than any multimillion-dollar contract he had ever signed. It was then that he made a decision. Arthur stood up and walked over to Miss Evelyn, who was placing empty platters onto a tray, smiling and exchanging kind words with everyone around her. When she saw him, her smile widened, as if she already knew what was about to happen. "Miss Evelyn," Arthur began, his tone mixing humility with determination. "I would like to say a few words, if you'll allow me." She nodded, her eyes sparkling with quiet curiosity. "Of course, dear, but only if you promise it comes from the heart." Arthur smiled, but he felt the weight of expectations. He knew he needed to be sincere, with her, with the others, and most importantly, with himself. Miss Evelyn caught everyone's attention in the hall by gently tapping a spoon against a bowl. Conversations quieted, and all eyes turned to Arthur. He felt a slight tremor in his hands, but he took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Good evening," he began, his voice a little shaky, but full of intent. "I want to thank you for having me here today. When I first entered this hall, I admit I didn't know what I was looking for. I thought maybe I was here to observe, perhaps to understand something I'd forgotten a long time ago." He paused, looking around. People were attentive, some curious, others still skeptical, but he felt that for the first time, they were truly seeing who he was. "But now I realize I was here to learn," he continued, "to remind myself that Christmas isn't about what we can buy or give materially. It's about being present. It's about sharing what we have that is most valuable. Our time, our attention, our love." Arthur looked at Ryan, who was at the back of the hall, still with his arms crossed, but his gaze less defiant. "And you were right," Arthur said, addressing him. "For so long, I thought donating money was enough, that signing checks and supporting causes from a distance was enough. But that was never enough. Not for me, and not for the people who truly matter." The hall was silent. Even the children, who had been running around before, seemed still, absorbing the gravity of the moment. Arthur took another step forward. "Today, you've taught me something I will never forget. You've taught me that the true spirit of Christmas isn't in the grand gestures, but in the small moments, the way we share a meal, the way we help each other, the way we smile at one another. And I am deeply grateful for that." He turned to Miss Evelyn and paused before continuing. "And, Miss Evelyn, I would like to help ensure that this feast continues for many years. But I don't want it to be just a donation. I want to be part of this. I want to be here every year, because you've given me something I didn't know I needed. Hope." Miss Evelyn smiled, and then the hall was filled with applause. The sound was warm, genuine, and Arthur felt something inside him finally break. An invisible barrier he had built over the years. Ryan, still at the back of the hall, let out a small sigh before approaching. When he reached Arthur, he paused, hesitating for a moment, then extended his hand. I guess you're not so bad after all," Ryan said with a crooked smile. Arthur shook his hand, feeling the symbolic strength of the gesture. "And I think I still have a lot to learn." In that moment, Arthur was no longer a stranger. He was part of that community, not for what he had, but for what he was willing to share. As the applause still echoed through the hall, Arthur felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. But he knew that his words, as sincere as they were, needed to be accompanied by actions. He looked around the hall once more, at each face that had welcomed him and, at some point that night, challenged him to be more than he was. He took a step toward the center of the room, and his voice rose above the conversations that were beginning to resume. "Before we continue celebrating," he said, "I'd like to share something else." The hall fell silent again, everyone turning their attention to the man who, just moments ago, was merely another unfamiliar face. Arthur ran his hands over his coat, as if searching for courage, and continued. "I've spent years accumulating money, achievements, possessions, things that, at the time, I thought were all that mattered. But today, here with you, I realize that none of that means anything unless it's used for something greater, something that truly makes a difference." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words he was about to say. "That's why I want you to know that, starting today, I will dedicate a significant portion of what I have to support initiatives like this. I want this feast, which is already so special, to become even bigger. I want to ensure that no one in this community spends a Christmas without hope, without food, without human warmth." Miss Evelyn looked at him with bright eyes but said nothing. She seemed to understand that this moment didn't need words. "But this isn't just a donation," Arthur continued. "It's a promise that I will be here, that I will be part of this. I don't want to be just a name on a list or a number in an account. I want to be here with you, learning, sharing, living the true spirit of Christmas." There was a pause, and then, to Arthur's surprise, Ryan stepped forward. He still carried some of the skepticism that had defined him throughout the night, but there was something different about him now. An openness, perhaps even a reluctant respect. "You know this won't erase everything you've done before, right?" Ryan said, not aggressively, but with honesty. Arthur nodded, a small smile on his face. "I know, Ryan, but I'm not trying to erase anything. I'm trying to start fresh." Ryan hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand again. Arthur shook it firmly, feeling that the gesture was more than a reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement that both had something to learn from each other. In the corner of the hall, Emma clapped her hands, and other children followed, starting a new wave of applause. This time, it wasn't just for Arthur, but for what he had decided to do, for what he was willing to sacrifice to find something greater than himself. Arthur looked at Miss Evelyn, who finally approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done something good tonight, dear. Something that will echo far beyond this hall." He looked at her, feeling the truth in her words, but at the same time, he knew there was still much work to be done. "Thank you, Evelyn. But this is just the beginning." Miss Evelyn smiled, the kind of smile that seemed to carry all the wisdom of a life well lived. "The beginning is always the most important." And as the hall filled again with laughter, conversations, and the sound of children playing around the tree, Arthur felt something different inside him. He was still the same man, with the same scars and the same mistakes, but something had changed. He was no longer alone. For the first time in many years, Arthur felt that he wasn't just living Christmas, he was part of it. The hall, now full of life and celebration, seemed to pulse with renewed energy. The lights on the small Christmas tree flickered irregularly, reflecting on the faces of the children playing around it. The tables were filled with almost empty plates, the platters of food reduced to the bare minimum, and the smell of desserts, pies, puddings, and cookies lingered in the air. Arthur was at the center of it all, not because he wanted to be the focus, but because something in him had changed so visibly that it was impossible not to notice. He was no longer the distant and reserved man who had walked through that door earlier that night. He was present, engaged, part of the community. Miss Evelyn approached with a serene smile. She was holding a bowl of punch and offered it to Arthur, who accepted with gratitude. "It's interesting, isn't it?" she said, looking around. "How one night can change everything." Arthur nodded. "More than I could have imagined." He paused, looking around the hall. "I've been so focused on chasing more money, more recognition, more success that I forgot what really matters. But here, with all of you, I found something I lost a long time ago." Miss Evelyn placed a hand on his arm. Christmas has that power, dear. It reminds us of what the heart knows, but the head sometimes forgets. Before Arthur could respond, Ryan appeared. He was carrying a tray of desserts and looked a little uncomfortable, as if he were still adjusting to the idea that Arthur wasn't just the millionaire he had imagined. "Hey," said Ryan, with a half smile. "Are you just going to stand there? Or are you going to help serve the kids?" Arthur laughed, grabbing the tray without hesitation. "I'm on it, boss." As he walked through the hall, handing out slices of cake and cookies to the children, something unexpected happened. Emma, holding her rag doll tightly, ran up to him and tugged at his hand. "Mr. Arthur, do you want to sing with us?" He stopped, surprised by her spontaneity. "Sing? Well, I think it's been a long time since I last sang." Emma smiled. "It's okay. We'll sing together." She pulled him over to the Christmas tree, where a group of children was already gathered, some holding makeshift instruments, spoons, pots, and even a small drum. Miss Evelyn began playing the piano, and the first notes of Jingle Bells echoed through the hall. Arthur hesitated for a moment, but then realized that no one there was expecting perfection. They just wanted him to be present. He took a deep breath and started singing, at first quietly, but then with more confidence, as the children laughed and clapped along to the rhythm of the music. The whole hall joined in the chorus, their voices filling the space with a joy that seemed to transcend everything: the cold outside, the difficulties of the year, the unresolved conflicts. In that moment, everyone was equal, connected by something greater than themselves. As the music continued, Arthur felt tears welling up in his eyes. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. Gratitude for being there, for finding something that no amount of money could buy. Gratitude for finally understanding that Christmas wasn't about presents or luxurious parties, but about love, belonging, and the magic of sharing. When the music ended, the hall erupted in applause and laughter. Emma looked at Arthur with a wide smile. "You sang well, Mr. Arthur." He laughed, gently tousling her hair. "Thank you, Emma, but I think Hope liked it more than you." She held the doll and laughed loudly. "Hope loves Christmas." Arthur looked at Miss Evelyn, who was watching him from a distance with a satisfied smile. He knew she had been right from the start. He hadn't come there just to observe. He had come to find himself again. And, somehow, he had succeeded. As the hall began to empty, Arthur remained in a corner, observing everything with a mix of satisfaction and unease. The tables were now emptier, the plates and platters being collected by volunteers, and the voices that once filled the space with joy started to fade in volume. Some families were saying their goodbyes, thanking one another for another shared feast, while others stayed behind, still warming themselves in the company that this place provided. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest. He had lived through a night that would change something inside him forever. But now, as the celebration dissipated, what came to the surface was a deep emptiness. What if all of this wasn't enough? Miss Evelyn, as if sensing the weight on his shoulders, approached with her calm demeanor, carrying 2 cups of hot tea. "Here," she said, handing one of the cups to Arthur. "A little tea solves a lot of things." Arthur accepted, but his mind was still elsewhere. He watched the steam rise from the cup, his thoughts swirling around the same questions that had haunted him for years. Finally, he broke the silence. "Evelyn," he began, his voice low, "I see all of this, all this beauty, this simplicity, but something in me still feels like I'm not worthy of being a part of it." She tilted her head, her gaze attentive, but she didn't interrupt. Arthur continued, his tone full of sincerity. "I've spent so much time living for myself, chasing things that now seem empty. I looked at people as numbers, as goals. And today, seeing what Christmas really is, I wonder if I can truly change. If I can be more than I was." Evelyn smiled slightly, as if recognizing the pain he was sharing. "Arthur, dear," she began, her voice soft but firm. "Change doesn't happen in a single moment. It's like building a Christmas feast. You gather small pieces, one dish at a time. And when you're done, there's something beautiful in front of you. But even then, sometimes it takes time to realize how special it is." Arthur gripped the cup tighter, looking at her. "But what if I fail? What if I promise myself I'll change and end up going back to the same old habits?" Evelyn took a small step forward and placed a hand on his arm, a comforting gesture. And if you fail, well, then you try again, and as many times as it takes. Christmas isn't about being perfect, Arthur. It's about believing that we can start over, even after we've messed up. Arthur felt a lump in his throat, but he couldn't say anything. He looked around the hall one last time, absorbing the small moments still happening around him. A mother rocking her baby while the father collected coats. Children sharing laughs as they put away their makeshift instruments. Ryan, now helping a volunteer carry platters to the kitchen. Every scene seemed to reinforce the lesson he had learned that night. That the true spirit of Christmas was in being present, in sharing, in building something bigger than ourselves. But the emptiness was still there. Not because he didn't believe what he had learned, but because he knew this transformation wouldn't be easy. He had taken the first step, but now he needed to walk the entire path. Evelyn, he finally said, looking at the woman who seemed to carry all the wisdom in the world. Do you think there's something for me beyond this? That I can really make a difference? Evelyn smiled again, but this time with an intensity that seemed to cut through all of Arthur's doubts. Arthur, the difference has already begun. It's in what you felt tonight. It's in what you decided to do, even though you can't yet see the fruits of it. Christmas gives us this gift, the chance to start, to plant something new. It doesn't matter how far you've strayed before, there's always a way back. You've already found yours. Her words stayed with him as the hall continued to empty. He watched every gesture, every smile, every farewell. It wasn't the end of the night, but the beginning of something much greater. And then, for the first time, Arthur smiled. It wasn't a forced or uncomfortable smile, but something genuine, coming from a place he had forgotten existed. Arthur stayed in the hall for a while longer, watching the people disperse. He helped clear plates, stack chairs, and even clean the floor, actions that would have been unthinkable for the man he had been until that night. Each gesture seemed simple, but carried deep meaning. It was as if, for the first time, he truly felt he was contributing, not just with his presence, but with his actions. Ryan watched him from a distance, still a little skeptical, but something in his posture had changed. He no longer saw Arthur as an intruder or someone out of place. He was beginning to see that the man in front of him was genuinely trying to become part of this community. When the last plate was put away and the hall became emptier than ever, Miss Evelyn approached again. This time, she was holding a hardcover notebook and a pencil. Arthur, before we leave, there's a small tradition we follow here. Arthur looked at her with curiosity as she handed him the notebook. Every time we have a Christmas feast like this, we ask people to leave a message. Something they've learned, something they're grateful for, or something they wish for the future. If you don't mind, I'd like you to write something too. He opened the notebook and saw page after page of messages written over the years. Some were short, others long, but all were filled with emotion and meaning. Arthur held the pencil for a moment, thinking. He wanted his words to be sincere, to reflect not only what he had felt that night, but also what he wished for the future. Finally, he wrote, "Tonight, I learned that Christmas is not about what we can give, but about how we can share who we truly are. Thank you for reminding me of what I had forgotten, that hope, love, and unity are the greatest gifts we can receive and offer. And I promise never to let this be lost again." He closed the notebook and handed it back to Miss Evelyn, who read the message in silence. When she finished, she looked at him with shining eyes. "You found something tonight, Arthur. And never forget, what you found here, you can take with you wherever you go." Arthur nodded, feeling the weight and truth of her words. Ryan, who had been leaning against one of the nearby tables, slowly approached. He seemed to hesitate, but finally spoke. "Look, maybe I judged you too quickly. You seem like someone who really wants to make a difference." Arthur extended his hand, and Ryan shook it firmly. "You challenged me to be better, Ryan. That's more than many people have done for me." Ryan gave a small smile, this time sincere. "Well, I guess we all learned something tonight." Emma appeared shortly after, holding her doll, now with a small Christmas ornament attached to its fabric dress. She looked at Arthur with a wide smile. "You're coming back next Christmas, right?" Arthur knelt down to her level. "I promise, Emma. And who knows, Maybe next Christmas we'll even cook something together." She laughed, hugging her doll tightly. "I hope you like cookies." As Emma ran back to her mother, Arthur looked around the hall one last time. The space, now almost empty, still carried the energy of that night, a warmth, a presence he knew he would never forget. He turned to Miss Evelyn, who seemed ready to leave but still wore her welcoming smile. "Evelyn," he began, "I'll never be able to thank you enough for tonight." She shook her head. "The only way to thank me, Arthur, is to keep living what you've learned here. And I know you will." Arthur nodded, a sense of peace finally taking over him. When the last people left the hall, Arthur stood outside for a moment, staring at the starry sky. The snow was falling slowly, covering the streets in silence, like a great blanket that seemed to calm everything around. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs in a way that made him feel alive, truly alive. Miss Evelyn, who was closing the hall door, approached him with the same serene smile she had worn all night. She held her coat closed against the cold, but still seemed to radiate warmth. "Well, dear, it looks like you found something you didn't know you were looking for," she said, watching Arthur's face with eyes that saw more than words could express. Arthur smiled back, but it was a smile full of humility and gratitude. "Yes, Evelyn, I found it, but I still feel like it's just the beginning." She nodded slowly. "It is, but sometimes all we need is a beginning. The rest depends on you." Arthur fell silent, watching her as she slowly walked away to join the other volunteers, who were dispersing into small groups. He saw Ryan across the street, walking alone with his hands shoved into his coat pockets. Before turning the corner, Ryan looked back, meeting Arthur's eyes. He nodded, a brief gesture, but one filled with meaning. Arthur returned the gesture, feeling that, despite all the difficulties, something genuine had been built between them. Arthur began to walk. The snow-covered streets were deserted, except for the footprints he left behind. Each step seemed filled with reflection, every inhale and exhale filling his mind with images of the night. He thought of Emma, with her rag doll and her bright eyes full of innocence. He thought of Ryan, with his initial anger that hid a deep need to be heard. He thought of Miss Evelyn, the anchor who guided that little world with wisdom and patience. And, above all, he thought of himself, of who he had been for so long and who he wanted to become. When he arrived home, Arthur opened the door and was greeted by silence. The contrast was almost overwhelming. The grand entry hall, with its polished floor and glittering chandeliers, felt cold and empty, as if it had no soul. He took off his coat and hung it slowly, realizing the symbolic weight of that gesture. It was as if he were leaving behind something more than just the night's chill. He walked into the living room. The Christmas tree, perfectly decorated by professionals, stood in the corner, lit by white lights that flickered in sync. It was beautiful, but it also seemed distant. Immaculate decoration, but lifeless. Arthur stopped in front of it and stood there, reflecting on the contrast between this tree and the small tree in the community hall, with its paper stars and garlands made from newspaper strips. He sighed, feeling the emptiness that perfection represented, and walked over to the couch, sitting down slowly. His mind was full of thoughts, but one image in particular kept appearing: Emma's smile as she held her doll named Hope. Arthur grabbed the phone, hesitated for a moment, then dialed his secretary's number. It was late, he knew, but he felt he couldn't wait. "Arthur?" said the sleepy voice on the other end. "Sorry to call at this hour," he began, his voice quiet but determined. "But I need you to set up a meeting with my philanthropy team for tomorrow morning. We have important work ahead." There was a pause on the line before his secretary responded. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell. Any specific guidance?" Arthur paused, looking at the Christmas tree in front of him. "Yes," he finally said. "I want to create an initiative that really makes a difference. Something local, close to the people, and I want to be involved. I want to be present." His secretary, though still surprised, responded with a positive tone. "Understood, sir. I'll take care of it." "Thank you," Arthur said before hanging up. He placed the phone on the table and sat quietly for a few moments, letting the words reverberate in his mind. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was making an empty gesture. He stood up, walked over to the tree, and took a small star-shaped ornament. He held it for a moment, thinking of Hope, of Emma, of everything that had happened that night. He walked over to a window and looked out at the snow that continued to fall softly, covering everything with a pure white layer. "This is just the beginning," he murmured to himself. "But now I know what really matters." The next morning, Arthur woke up early, something he hadn't done in a long time. The sun shone faintly through the curtains of his window, reflecting off the fresh snow that had accumulated overnight. He got up feeling a different kind of energy. Not the usual rush to meet commitments, but a renewed sense of purpose. After getting dressed, he went to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee. As the aroma spread through the room, Arthur looked again at the star he had taken from the tree the night before, now resting on the table. He picked it up and held it between his fingers, feeling its symbolic weight. That little star wasn't just a decoration. It was a reminder of what he had learned and what still needed to be done. When he arrived at the office, his team was already gathered in the meeting room. Although the atmosphere was different from usual, they were used to cold, pragmatic discussions. But today, Arthur entered the room with a smile that seemed to light up the space. "Good morning," he began, his words firm but welcoming. "Today, I want to share something with you. Last night, I took part in something that changed my life. It wasn't a big event or an important meeting. It was a community dinner where people with so little managed to create something extraordinary and taught me lessons I had forgotten." The team watched him in silence, intrigued. "I want the focus of our foundation to change," Arthur continued. "I want us to work to support local initiatives, to create real connections with the people who need us. Not just donations. I want to be present, and I want our organization to be more than numbers on a report. I want it to be a force of hope." As he explained his plan, the faces in the room began to change, moving from surprise to admiration. They knew that something profound had happened to Arthur. After the meeting, Arthur felt that he had taken the first concrete step on his journey. But he knew that his transformation wouldn't be limited to his work. He needed to live this out in every area of his life. That night, back at home, he turned on the Christmas tree lights. He sat beside it with a notebook in hand, the same one he had bought months ago but never used. He opened it to the first page and began to write. "Today, I realized that Christmas is not just a day, but a way of living. A constant reminder that the greatest wealth we have is in the connections we create and the love we share. I hope this will be the first of many Christmases where I am truly present, not just for others, but for myself." He closed the notebook with a satisfied sigh and looked at the illuminated tree. This time, it no longer seemed empty. And as Arthur reflected on everything that had changed in such a short time, he knew he was not just starting a new chapter in his life, he was creating a legacy. If you too want to transform your Christmas into something special, creating unforgettable moments with those you love, we have something unique for you. The ebook, Sweet Christmas Memories, Simple Recipes to Warm the Soul, is more than just a recipe book. It's an invitation to build memories that warm the heart, just like Arthur discovered. With simple recipes full of love, you can gather your family, reclaim the magic of Christmas, and create moments that will stay in your memory forever. To get your copy and start your own journey of hope and connection, click the link in the pinned comment below. Because Christmas isn't just about what you eat, but who you share it with. Don't miss any videos. Subscribe now and let us know what you thought of this video in the comments.